All right. Good morning. What a beautiful Sabbath it is this morning. A little bit warmer than it has been all week. Quite nice in that. Today we're looking at an exclusive relationship, continuing our series on Committed to Jesus. We see here in Luke chapter 14, verse 26. Jesus says to those around him, and this is not just his immediate group of disciples, but this is a larger group of disciples that have gathered around him here. And he says, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple." This is one of those verses that doesn't get preached very often. It's one of the hard teachings of Jesus. How do we deal with this that Jesus is saying if we come to him and we don't hate everyone and everything else, we can't be his disciple? Does he mean that literally? I don't think so either. But when we look at this concept of coming to Jesus, and if we love Jesus so much that we're going to commit and be a full-on true follower of Jesus, then it will look, by comparison, as if we hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself. Because we won't regard those as being as important as Jesus. And this is one of the things that had come through in looking and writing this series on Committed to Jesus. It is inspired by Kyle Idleman's book, Not a Fan. And one of the things that he says in this is that Jesus and that God is not looking for being the one of many. He's looking for being the one and only. That there's no other relationship that we should have other than that relationship with God. When God spoke to the people of Israel from Mount Sinai and gave them the 10 Commandments in Exodus chapter 20 and verse 3, he said, "You shall have no other gods before me." That did not mean that I have to be number one on your list of priorities. I have to be number one on your list of gods. The before me means in my presence. That if you are in my presence, you have no other God. You have no other allegiance other than to me. And Jesus here is expanding on that and showing some things that God is looking for committed followers. And when we look at this and we try to understand, well, what does it mean to hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, in comparison to our love for Jesus? And when we look at this concept of the exclusive relationship that he is looking for, this isn't just saying that, okay, well, my family priorities or my life priorities are first is God, and second is family, and third is work, and so on and so forth. This is looking at God is our priority. And he becomes the definition of how we do everything else. The love that we have for God and the love that he has for us is what informs and forms our love for other people. It's what informs and forms how we go about doing work. We do it to the full and to the best of our ability, because that is what God does when he does work. And the more that we are becoming like God, and the more that we are entering into committed relationship with Him, we are going to become more like Him and stay connected with Him in this. This is not the only hard teaching of Jesus. There was a teaching that Jesus gave that His disciples, many of His disciples, said was so difficult it could not be accepted. We find that in John chapter 6, verse 60, we see this. He says, when many of His disciples heard it, they said, "This teaching is difficult. Who can accept it?" But Jesus, being aware that His disciples were complaining about it, said to them, "Does this offend you? Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where He was before?" He says, "It is the Spirit that gives life. The flesh is useless. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. But among you there are some who do not believe." Jesus had just told them about Him being the fulfillment of the manna which came from heaven, the fulfillment of the bread of the presence that was eaten there in and on the table of showbread in the sanctuary. And Jesus says all of this, and when there are people saying, like, this is difficult, how can I accept it? And Jesus knows, and He says, but among you there are some who do not believe. For Jesus knew from the first who were the ones that did not believe and who was the one that would betray Him. Jesus knew who these people were going into things. He knew who Judas was when He allowed Judas to come along and follow, when He allowed Judas to be the treasurer of the group and to handle the money, which John reveals later that Judas was embezzling and skimming off the top. He was taking some for himself out of everything he was doing. He knew the ones that were dedicated to Him, and He knew the ones that were just there because He had been around. Jesus wants us to count the cost of discipleship. Jesus counted the cost of bringing in Judas. He counted the cost of allowing and inviting and bringing others along who He knew did not believe. He counted the cost. He knew what it would do, but it was worth it to Him for those who did believe and for those who would become the apostles and would change the world after they were filled with the Holy Spirit. He wants us to count the cost. We go back to Luke chapter 14. We pick up in verse 28. He says, "For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.'" My senior year at Walla Walla, I remember there was a big renovation project that was going on at the shopping mall in Walla Walla. And it had been under a lot of trouble for quite some time, and there were only two kind of anchor stores that were doing anything there anymore anyway. And a new construction company had bought it, and they were going to tear it down and rebuild it and renovate it, bring it back to life and all of this. And then the economy crashed. That 2008 economy crash that we had. And the builder ran out of funds. And the last I had seen it was probably about 2010, maybe 2011. but it was in the same shape that it had been a couple of years before. Half torn down, half cleaned up, with a fence around it so you couldn't get in there and hurt yourself. Or at least so you couldn't sue their insurance if you got in there and hurt yourself. And it became kind of a joke that they tried something, they didn't have enough to finish. They started the project, they didn't have enough to finish. That's what Jesus doesn't want for us. He doesn't want us to choose to follow him and to enter relationship with him, and then when things get hard, we walk away and people are like, well, I guess he never really had faith to begin with, did he? I guess she never really believed God in those cases, did she? That's the kind of thing that ends up happening when we become fans of Jesus rather than followers. And Jesus talks a little bit more about this in seeing this earlier in John chapter 6, starting in verse 22. It says, "The next day the crowd that had stayed on the other side of the sea saw that there had been only one boat there. They also saw that Jesus had not got into the boat with his disciples, but that his disciples had gone away alone." This was the crowd of people that Jesus had fed with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And the next day, they're looking for him. Where'd he go? What's going on? Where is he? He didn't get in the boat with the disciples, so where is he? Where do we find him? What's happening here? It says, "Then some boats from Tiberias came near the place where they had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks." So when they didn't find him there was some people got out on the boats and they sailed across. They went to the place where they had been the day before. This is where he fed us bread after giving thanks. Maybe this is going to be the place. And no, he wasn't there. It says, "So when the crowd saw that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they themselves got into the boats and went to Capernaum looking for Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, 'Rabbi, when did you come here?' Jesus answered them, 'Very truly I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves.'" Jesus knew the hearts of these who were coming. These are the people who are coming. They're wanting bread, and he starts talking about spiritual bread. He starts talking about living bread. These are the ones who hear, and this teaching is difficult. Who can accept it? We see it in John 6:51. Jesus says, "I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh." You look at that just on the surface, that sounds like cannibalism. That sounds unpleasant. That sounds like something I don't want to participate in. I do not want to eat the flesh of another person. The concept, revulses me. But Jesus continues saying, "Very truly I tell you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood have eternal life, and I will raise them up on the last day. For my flesh is true food, and my blood is true drink. Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them." We understand this to be symbolic. we understand that Jesus is speaking of typology. He's speaking of the types that were set forth in the manna, the type that was set forth in the bread of the presence, the type that was set forth in the drink offerings that were on the table of the bread of the presence and libation. We know what he was talking about because we have taken the time to commit and understand the basic principles of what Jesus is about, right? But the fan looks at this kind of a statement. The uncommitted follower of Jesus looks at this statement and says, ugh, no thanks, I'm out. The fan looks at the statement of, unless you hate father and mother, wife and children, sister and brother, and even life itself, you cannot be my follower. And says, ooh, I don't think I can love anyone so much that it would even seem like, and that's just looking at the principle of things, let alone just taking that literally. But when we look at the principle of that, even still, it's some of it, I don't know if I could love someone, love Jesus so much that I appear to hate everyone else by comparison. But here's the difference in that, and here's where all of this comes to bear, is that when the love of God is in us, it is no longer I who is doing the loving. I am not the one, when I am a follower of Jesus Christ, I am not the one who loves my wife. Because I am incapable of truly loving anyone without expecting something in return, because I am sinful. But when the love of God forms and informs my love for everyone else, then I can love my wife with God's love. Not because she does something for me, but because of who she is and the value that she adds to life itself, not even just mine, but to life itself. I can love my daughter because I understand not what benefits she adds to me. I know some friends of mine who are very politically minded, who jokingly refer to their children as their tax credits, their tax deductions. And I know they don't mean it as that's the only reason that their child is valuable to them. They love their children. But when they refer to their child as the tax deduction, they're reminding themselves, I get something for having become a parent. I get a little bit of something, a small break back from having become a parent. I get a little bit. But I love my daughter not because I get a tax break from her. She's a big expense. Can't get away from it. But I love her because her existence helps me understand God's love for me even more. And in turn, God's love for me helps me love her better. It is not something that I am capable of doing without God's influence. Without being a committed follower of God, I cannot love as He defines love. So I have to commit. And I have to have a disinterested love. I'm not loving in order to get love back. I'm loving because that is who I am in God now. I am faithful because that is who I am in God. And because he respects us and is faithful to us, I respect my wife and am faithful to my wife. You see how each thing follows from the other. God does not want to be your one of many. Even the first of many. He wants to be your one and only. And everything else comes after. And he's given us that example in himself as well. And Jesus coming, dying on the cross for our benefit, giving his body, spilling his blood on our behalf. He showed that we were not just one of many, but his extra special, precious possession, his one and only. It's the reason the church is referred to as the bride of Christ. We're not one of many. To him, we are one and only. That's how desperately he wanted to be with us again and reconcile after sin. And that is the kind of relationship that he is calling us to have, the kind of commitment to him that he is calling us to have as well. So as we go and wash one another's feet and partake of the Lord's Supper, let us remember that we are called here not to put God as first above all, but to put God as first and only, to be our one and only in everything that we do. Ladies will go to the fellowship hall, straight across through the double doors there to wash feet, and gentlemen, we will meet in the overflow room.